Do you feel it's true?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty obvious we're coming up on, Christmas Eve here, and I want to put out once again, no matter how many times they've studied how to get more people to come to a Unity Center, it's that 80% of the people who come have been invited by somebody to come check us out. So I want you to think about the people that you know, and someone who would resonate with what we're about, and be willing to invite them to check us out. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve are great times to do that. So good morning. There was a pastor at a church. It was Christmas time, and he was trying to generate more revenue, get people to give more. So he makes his pitch. He says, "Whoever gives the largest amount today gets to pick 3 hymns." And so they bring in the collection, and the board treasurer is just blown away. And he sneaks up to the pastor and hands him this $10,000 check from this woman in the sanctuary. And he says, "Wow." And he says, and he comes here and says, "Come on, come forward. This is so generous of you. Thank you so much. Do you know the 3 hymns you want?" And she looked at some gentlemen in the congregation and said, "I want him, him, and him." I know this week Carla was communicating with somebody out on Facebook who came across our stuff and was intrigued, and "Are you Unitarian?" It's like, no, unity is different than Unitarians. But the word unity, Charles Fillmore, Charles and Myrtle, of course, started the movement back, in the 1889. But during the 1890s, as I started to put out their newsletter, Charles was looking for a name, and in his meditation, it came to him, unity. And for him, the sense was, okay, we are already one with God. There's no need to be more spiritual. We're already a spiritual being having a human experience. Then, of course, the oneness of us, is recognizing that we're all part of this greater consciousness that is. And it's probably the great truths of the ages, being willing to, as Elliot and the music team was singing, you are a powerful, creative, spiritual being. That sense of oneness, that sense of wholeness. The word, of course, as Unity, we're a spiritual center, but of course we kind of get lumped in with other religions. But the word religion, when you look at the root of it, it means to bind together again. And in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, first chapter, 26th verse, of course, God says, "Let us make man and woman in our own image, after our own likeness." So unity takes this different approach to the Bible. Of course, the first question usually people do you take the Bible literally? It's like, well, no, we don't. We recognize that there are some historical aspects and historical facts that are in there, but the main idea of this is to look at how we bring out that consciousness, that remembrance that we're one with God. So some of the stories, all of the parables, all of the narrative stories in the Bible have symbolism in it on how to live as a spiritual being having a human experience. And so there was this repeated theme throughout the Old Testament, or as we now call it, the Hebrew Scriptures, of where the people would forget. And they'd get all caught up in the physical world and the world of the 5 senses, and then things would become unpleasant, but a leader would step forward, or a judge, and would lead them back to that awareness that they're one, and things would become pleasant again. Starting, of course, with the first story of Adam and Eve. Of course, they kind of forgot who they truly were and got kicked out of that wonderful Garden of Eden. So today I wanted to kind of dig into a Bible passage. It's the story known as the parable of the prodigal son. It's during Jesus. Jesus is teaching this in the Gospel of Luke. So I want to drill a little bit deeper into the symbolism, because this is one of the stories that, yeah, sure, it makes sense literally, but when you understand the symbolism, it was powerful for me to understand the deeper meaning of it all. So in the Gospel of Luke, 15th chapter, starting with the 11th verse, Jesus says, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the inheritance that falls to me.' And he divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took his journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in loose living. And when he had spent everything, a great famine arose in that country, and he began to be in want. So he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed swine. And the younger son would gladly have fed on the pods that the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have plenty to eat, but I perish here in hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him coming and had compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, put shoes on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and make merry. For this my younger son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found.' And they began to make merry. And now his elder son was in the field, and he came and drew near to the house. He heard music and dancing. He called out to one of the servants and asked, 'What's this all about?' And the servant said, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he is back safe and sound.' The elder son became angry. He refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. And he answered his father, 'Lo, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a fatted calf, that I might make merry with my friends. But this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with harlots. You killed for him the fatted calf.' And the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to make merry and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is now alive. He was lost and now is found.'" A lot of people are struck by the unconditional love, that the Father is expressing, the forgiveness. And of course, I think we all know or have heard of fathers who weren't all that forgiving, or all that loving under similar circumstances. But to understand any story in the Bible is basically starts with Genesis and ends with Revelation. In Genesis, it's we're just beginning to awaken to the fact that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. But then we hit the Gospels, where we take it to a whole new level, and then in Revelation, we kind of have the final battle between our own stubbornness and accepting that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So each of the narrative stories is us. It's about our inner dialogues, things that are going on within us. It's not a matter of talking about someone who lived 2,000 years ago. What we're talking about now is that inner dialogue that goes on between different aspects of ourselves. So to understand the metaphysics and the symbolism of it, as I've said quite a few times, whenever we have a male character in these Bible stories, it represents some aspect of our thinking nature. And any female character is some aspect of our feeling nature. So, we've got essentially 3 men here that we're talking about, the father and the 2 sons. And it's interesting that they don't have specific names, because specific names in the Bible, of course, represent various things, like Peter represents faith. So, especially when you don't have a name assigned, it's definitely about, like I say, us. So, this father in this story represents that God consciousness that's inside all of us. The younger son symbolizes that inner rebel. Have you ever had a chance to express your inner rebel. So he is totally asleep to the fact that he's a spiritual being having a human experience. And like so many people, especially coming out of high school or college, you want to go make your mark in the world. And this is about those five senses that, of course, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, but not having any consciousness of the spiritual being, the sixth sense. And I don't know about you, but I've been misled by my five senses from time to time. Gotten myself into trouble just going from that aspect. And it wasn't really until my spiritual awakening at age 30 that I finally recognized those years in that far country. Those years when I had to kind of prove to myself who I was not so that I could appreciate who I truly was. So, it's interesting because it says loose living, which we'll talk about letting the imagination run wild with what it was. But he comes to that point where, he's suddenly in famine. So every individual goes through a rebel stage, sometimes more than once during the lifetimes. I'm familiar with one woman in her 70s after her husband passed away. She found a new boyfriend, and suddenly she was off to the races, and her children were kind of like, what's happened to her? It's like, well, no, she's finally letting that inner rebel out after being so, strict in the life that she had had before that. So the Wheel of Fortune, before it was a game show on TV, it meant the fact that this outer part of the wheel, sometimes we're at the top, sometimes we're at the bottom, sometimes we're in between, going either up or down. So that's what life is all about. We're going to have a variety of experiences, some pleasant, some unpleasant, and some somewhat neutral. Now, the older brother, it's interesting. A lot of times when you hear people talk about the story, they forget to read those last few verses about the older brother. The older brother represents that conforming part of us. It's like we know the right thing to do and we do it. And, sometimes in a religious setting, you can kind of get carried away. So where you're feeling like, the truth and everybody else should know it too. Yet, at times, this part of us feels restricted. And you can see that inner dialogue that happens between the younger son and the older son within us. It's like, what's the right thing to do? And of course, day to day, week to week, we make these decisions. Now consider that the older son may not have literally left home in this story, but he possibly left that God consciousness as well. If he's caught up in feeling like he had to do something because he had to do something, it was an obligation, that he was actually suffering from bondage of a different type. So the younger son goes out to win the game of materialistic accumulation. And sometimes we need to stroke our ego, doing it all on my own, which never happens in truth. So instead of getting something from the world when we start out, we find that we're only going to get back what we are able to put in. We need to give something to the world first. This is the whole concept of tithing, being willing to, give first in faith and know that we'll have a consistent, abundant supply. So let's get back to the younger son coming to know want. Consider that this could be either a lack of the things that we need every day or accumulating more than we could ever use. We get to that point where we say, is this all there is? We have, so many people have had that experience. Like I said, mine was at age 30. It's kind of like, what have I been doing? What the hell was I thinking? I didn't waste my time, though. Like I said, I was able to prove who I was not so that I could truly embrace who I was. So, oftentimes when we forget that we're spiritual beings having a human experience, we demonstrate a crisis in one of the areas of our life, like health, occupation, relationships, financial supply, spiritual growth. And our minds are meaning-finding machines. We want to find meaning in everything. And I don't know about you, but I found that it wasn't until I turned within and really understood that spiritual aspect of myself that I found meaning in my life. Looking for love in all the wrong places. So yeah. In the Gospel of John, 5th chapter, 19th verse, Jesus says, I of myself can do nothing. It is the Father within me who does all the work. And Jesus wasn't just talking about himself, he was talking about you, he was talking about me. He was a model for how we should live our lives. So if we're recognizing that, yeah, we can out there thinking that we're doing it all ourselves, but we aren't really, or we can make it work for a little while, but then suddenly we get to that point of famine. Suddenly there just doesn't seem to be any meaning, any substance in our life. But when we reawaken to the fact that, wow, yeah, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, success does not come from getting there. It comes from earning the right to be there. So the younger son in the famine gets a job feeding pigs or hogs. And that's pigs or hogs in these Bible stories represent life at its lowest ebb. The lowest possible relationship of life. And of course, in Jewish law, they didn't eat pork. So you can imagine the embarrassment of having to watch hogs eating better than you are. So regardless of whether you're rich or poor, it's a matter of, are you feeling empty? Do you feel that you've really embraced your purpose? There's an important line, and I love the way this is worded. It's the 17th verse where he says, but when he came to himself, he said, many of my father's hired servants had plenty of food. Now it's interesting. He didn't blame other people for his predicament. He didn't cry out for help or act out in anger. He just changed his mind, which of course is the meaning of the word repent. You changed my mind. It's like, oh, that V8 moment. Here I am here and I could be there. So where is here and where is there to you? Where is it that you want to be? Well, you can arise and go to the Father. Go to that place. And of course, so many people in Unity have gone through a 12-step program or, Alcoholics Anonymous and something. One of the major tenets of it is admit that you've got a problem, that you have surrendered control of your life, to whatever the substance is that you're abusing. And there is a spiritual concept, and that is the most important part of learning is to unlearn the old assumptions that we have accumulated before and that don't work for us anymore. There's a word that's been severely abused in recent decades, and that's the word freedom. Friedrich Schiller, a German philosopher who lived from 1759 to 1805, and was a good friend of Goethe, said, freedom is not just doing what one wants, but becoming what one must become. So we open our minds to the divine mind. We get the divine guidance, which comes through our intuition, and we do what it is we know we need to do. Now notice in this parable, the Father is calm and collected throughout the whole thing. And if it represents the God consciousness, that's the way God is. Notice that he didn't say to his younger son, are you nuts? I'm not going to just give you half of the property. And he just lets him go. Because in each of us we have that willpower, the ability to make our choices in life. And it's only by making those choices and having those experiences that we grow. We have free will. We let God be God through us. A building can have electrical service, but until you plug something in, you're not using it at all. So plug into that spiritual consciousness of yours. So another point that strikes me is he was rehearsing a speech before going back to Dad. Father, I have sinned against you. I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. The challenge there is that he's still thinking of himself as being in bondage. It's like, okay, I'm just going to go back and I'll work for Dad. He'll hire me, pay me what he pays his servants and that sort of thing. No, what we want you to do is to be able to express who you truly are. Use your gifts, your passions, and your talents to serve the world. In other words, we need to give up the strong tendency in most of us to punish ourselves when we haven't lived up to what we know is the best within us. So when he reaches his father, he starts out, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But he doesn't mention being a servant to his dad. Instead, at that point, Dad's like, "Bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet." Well, the robe represents a new self-image, that sense of stepping into our power. So the younger son is stepping into his power. The ring is kind of that commitment to something, right? Or an award in some cases. The ring is just that commitment to the fact that, yeah, I now understand that I am always connected with the Father, the spiritual consciousness. And then shoes, feet in these Bible stories are symbolic of understanding. So he has a new understanding of being a spiritual being, having a human experience. So let's go back to the older brother. Is he too religious to be spiritual? Is he too holy to be human? Behind this facade of being the faithful servant, though, there's jealousy, bitterness, resentment. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. "I worked hard all of these years, and what did it get me?" Well, what did you expect it to get you? This attitude also seems to forget that we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So when the older son complains to the father responds with something that we all need to remember. And this may be the most important part of the story, but it's often the least talked about. "Son, daughter, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." There's no way we can separate ourselves from that spiritual consciousness, that God consciousness. It's always there, always ready to give us that electricity, to animate what it is that we need to do, and let us be who we need to be. This is all something we need to embrace and live, and I haven't mastered it yet. But the younger son needed to drop the feeling that he needed to punish himself, but also the older brother needed to drop the need to punish himself. Understand that regardless of what you've done, yeah, even that, you're forgiven. God is that stable, centered place within us that says, okay, so you made a mistake. Let's get on with it. The Father is always there regardless of what we do. So, this week's takeaways. Meditate on how these aspects surface in your own life this week. What within you is the Father? When do you see the older son surfacing? When do you see the younger son surfacing? What does it mean for you to go into a far country? And have you been there already? And what does it mean when he came to himself? That awakening that happens within you. So this is your story. And we can all return to that centeredness, that awareness. No matter how many times we trip and fall, we can get up and keep going. And when we do that, there will be a celebration within us. Once again, we will eat, drink, and be merry. And from the Gospel of Luke, our closing verse, "And the Father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." May you always be open to God's guidance and grace. Let's prepare for meditation.